Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me. Due to familiar reasons, I couldn't be there in Tallinna as I would like to do, but thanks to the technology we can discuss about this amazing topic. To what extent the state is able to manage a health crisis like this one we are currently managing. Let me start by a little story. The Italian historian Luciano Canfora tells of a certain Monsieur de Langeais, back on the French Revolution, who had the misfortune to suffer two trials, one brought by his wife on the charge of impotence, and the other by a mistress for having given her a child. Everyone said that he would at least win one of the two, but instead he lost them both. I was reminded on this story when I realized that on the occasion of the pandemic, democratic governments have received a double recrimination in opposite directions, either because they are too weak or because they are too strong. On the one hand, the more or less explicit appeal to a strong power, and on the other hand, the demonstrations against health measures in the name of the freedom of individuals, who should be able to do whatever they want, even at the risk of the lives of others. We say that this health crisis will test many things, and that some of them will never be what they were, including democracy, including nation state. There has already been intense debate between those who believe that this crisis will be a shock that will bring down capitalism, and those who foresee a system of control that will consolidate in the opposite direction the authoritarian tendencies inscribed in what we call illiberal democracies. The problems that crises like this one pose for a democratic state can be grouped into at least three groups: the problem of exception, the problem of effectiveness, and the problem of social change. Let's begin with the first of the problems posed to democracy by the logic of exception. Situations of exception do not suspend democracy, nor its deliberative and political dimension. Pluralism remains intact, and normal social disagreement continues to exist, even if its expression must be conditional on facilitating the priority objective of the health emergency. Being in a situation of alarm does not mean renouncing the exercise of reason and depriving oneself of the benefits of calm and fair deliberation. Democracy, even in times of alarm, needs contradiction and demands justifications. Pluralism is not only, that is my main hypothesis, pluralism is not only a normative requirement, but also a principle of rationality. A democracy owes as much to its critics as to its rules. If a context of minimal trust is generated, distributed knowledge and decentralized power are not an impediment to decision-making, but proceeding for minimizing errors. Situations of alarm do not suspend pluralism, but only its competitive dimension. In my opinion, it would be a mistake if the urgency of the moment were to prevent us from contrasting points of view and competencies. Those who now confuse being in charge with being right may be tempted to forget that distinction forever. A constitutional democracy institutionalizes distrust of any extension of the prerogatives of power, based on the historical memory that we all have, that power is often irresistibly tempted to keep them for itself. It is always easier to grant new powers to those in charge of for instance, our security or our health, than to give them back. Democracies are characterized by zealously managing any delegation of power and making any exceptional powers conditional on a plan, objectives, and a time frame. The second problem of democratic states seems to be their effectiveness in solving urgent problems when time and authority are dramatically scarce resources. Compared to our slow decision-making, weak social control, and restraint in invading people's privacy, totalitarian systems would be better equipped for such situations. And given that turbulence and crisis are going to be the new normal, the temptation to eschew democratic formalities and rights is a powerful one. Anyway, democratic governments have many problems of ineffectiveness, but these problems are not due to the fact that they have to respect popular will and legal procedures, nor are autocracies a model of effectiveness. You should bear in mind that the debate on this issue is currently superimposed on a battle of narratives over a reputation in the midst of gigantic information manipulation. It may be a long time before we learn of the cruelty that took place in that enclosed space in Wuhan, and in general, before we learn the real facts about the pandemic in China. This is, in my opinion, the real heart of the matter: the relationship between power and information. Authoritarian regimes have a problem with information in two ways: outwards and inwards. The former is obvious, and we are all paying the price for it. We would have preferred to be supplied with true information in time rather than masks at the wrong time. The second information problem is internal and shows that repressing information is not a sign of strength, but a harbinger of future weakness. The regime's authoritarianism, lack of freedom of expression, and obstacles to the flow of information are the root of the crisis management failures. I mean, in China and in other authoritarian states. The democratic states have other kind of problems as well. The principle imposed on local administrative cadres by the central power means that only good news reaches Beijing, or at least bad news is disguised. This is why the measures against the epidemic have turned out to be chaotic and counterproductive, especially when the Wuhan police, as you perfectly remind, prefer to arrest and repress the doctors who had issued the alerts rather than listen to the warnings and take precautions against the epidemic raised. In sum, totalitarian efficiency, if it exists at all, is never aimed at protecting citizens in a totalitarian state, but at the survival of the regime, what is something radically different. Democracies and democratic states have a third serious problem with the intentional, what we can call intentional production of social transformation, be they reforms or transitions. It must be the fact that we live in democracies where there is little transformation that explains why, when a catastrophe strikes, those who most despaired that it could be possible to change society through ordinary political will turned out to be the ones most hopeful that nature will put things right. I am referring to Cisse when he announces once again the imminent arrival of the new communism, for example. That's to say, the big transformation is expected that failure will mechanically produce its opposite. This is, to me, a sacrificial vision of political history that has nothing to do with the change inherent to democracies, a change that is conflictive and agreed at the same time. Those who come to the fore in this way seem to me to be telling the natural history of disasters rather than the human story. Catastrophes provide evidence of damage, but not of healing. This idea that from sacrifice comes emancipation is as unbelievable as ensuring that those who need it most will benefit from the shock, necessarily. There are at least two assumptions in this expectation that are hard to believe: that the negative will produce the positive, and that this new positivity will be distributed fairly. A new order does not necessarily emerge from the ruins, and change can be for the worse, as history tells us in many, many examples and models of our history. If the slow democratic apprenticeship has taught us anything, it is that we should not exempt ourselves from the guarantees and limitations that democracy has imposed on itself to prevent change for the worse. And the most important thing, also in exceptional times, is to protect, that is my main message for this talk, to protect pluralism, both in terms of the measures to come out of the crisis and the transition we must undertake after it. Pluralism is the most important thing and the most important procedure to make rightly the things we have to make. The real power of what is the real power then of democracy? Democracy has always been under suspicion of being incompetent, especially in situations of urgency and special gravity. As you surely remind, Demosthenes lamented Athens' sluggishness in the face of the expansionist threats of Philip II of Macedon, while the Athenians were busy discussing and voting. Nothing was stopping the military campaign that threatened them. From then until the criticism of parliamentarism at the beginning of the 20th century, the reproach is always the same. The discussion of the Democrats is a waste of time, and only decisive leadership of autocrats, but also of technicians and experts, can put an end to this waste of time and postponement of problems that would characterize our democratic states. This is the accusation. Well, in the midst of our health crisis, many democratic states are putting on a show of indecision, contradiction, and confusion, affecting the public's confidence in measures that have been adopted, at times presented in an incoherent manner. The pandemic has made the old criticism of impotence more plausible. That's quite normal. Times of distress are very prone to infer from specific mistakes a general incapacity, and to let's say to raise the price one would be willing to pay for solutions. Well, in my opinion, we can summarize this accusation by stating that democracy would be incapacitated by its slow procedures, by the right of contestation allowed to everyone, and by the element of idleness that characterizes democratic deliberation. Advocates of haste cannot understand that talking is a form of action, and seem to consider that political action produces more effects than the quieter it is. Advocates of empowering governments to deal with crisis propose that the first courts will dispense with the deliberative dimension of democracy, that there will be less talk and more action. Well, anyway, collective decisions, however urgent they may be, can, in a democracy, only be taken in the midst of a conflicting interpretation of reality, and in the midst of an explicit confrontation of interests. To think that politics can avoid this moment of discussion in order to tackle solutions directly is, in my opinion, to fail to understand the nature of politics and even the human condition itself. What then would be the power, the real power of democracies, even in times of crisis, dealing with big and huge crises like this pandemic? The power of democracies as opposed to the supposed authoritarian efficacy. What is the strength of democracy? Where due to its capacity, what if, in my opinion, I would say, what if the recognition of uncertainty and the concerted will to confront it were one of its most advantageous virtues? What if the strength of democracy were due to its capacity to protect criticism, including criticism of itself? Democratic governments, so to speak, compensate for their difficulties of control by allowing open and public debate about possible alternatives. The refrain that democracies are impotent, a refrain that places those who want them to be so, this refrain blames disagreement for this. The wise Spinoza Baruch Spinoza, on the other hand, saw the power of democracies in the lack of unanimity, where tyrannies are arbitrary and untouchable. In a democracy, I quote Spinoza, absurdity is less to be feared, since it is almost impossible for the majority of men to agree on one and the same absurdity. End of the quote. Spinoza was not ignoring human errors. He was simply warning that in a plural society it is more difficult to make them than in one in which pluralism could have been suppressed. Disagreement has many drawbacks, but at least disagreement prevents obstinacy in error. This is more or less the Spinoza's thesis, as I can translate it. Even assuming that democracies and authoritarianisms are equally likely to err, it is better that this could be the very Spinoza's hypothesis. It is better to err in a democracy, because in a democracy, due to the contexted nature of public opinion and its competitive regime, it is easier and quicker to abandon the error or to be forced to abandon it. Democracy, and this is my conclusion, on the hand of Spinoza political treaty, democracy is a political system in which open learning processes can take place, fueled by reasoned criticism of the authorities and their mistakes, so that it is always possible to correct them and even replace those who made them. The power of democracy is its capacity to learn. Thank you very much for your attention.